The new Duchess of Ashmore arrived on a Wednesday in November, and the maid named Nell wept. She did not weep in the courtyard where the traveling carriage drew to a stop, nor in the great hall where the household had been assembled in 2 straight lines since 9:30. She waited, as she had learned to wait, until the hall was emptied of ceremony and the upper servants had retreated to their business, and then she stepped into the passage between the kitchen and the silver room, and pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth, and wept with the particular silence of a woman who has had long practice at it. The footman Thomas passed the end of the passage, and did not look in. He never looked in at things that were not his concern. It was a quality she had once considered a virtue in him. The reason Nell wept was not the one the other servants assumed when they whispered about it later over their supper. They assumed she wept because she had loved the late Duchess. And in one sense this was true. The late Duchess had been dead for 14 months. And Nell had already completed that grief in a different passage, on a different morning, with a different wrist at her mouth. What she wept for on the Wednesday in November was something older and more precise. She wept because she recognized, in the set of the new Duchess's jaw as she descended from the carriage and surveyed Ashmore Park for the first time, a quality she had last seen on the face of the woman who had raised her. Her name before she had entered service was Eleanor Margaret Foss. She was 24 years old. She had been at Ashmore Park for 3 years, beginning as a housemaid of the lower sort, and rising by means of reliability and an unusual talent for pressed linen to the position of lady's maid under the late Duchess. When the late Duchess died, Nell had stayed on, because the Duke, whose name was Charles Whitmore, had asked her to, in the particular way he had, of asking things that were not questions. He had come to the door of the late Duchess's sitting room on the 3rd day after the death, while Nell was sorting through a drawer of gloves that no one would ever wear again. And he had stood in the doorway and said, "I would ask you to remain in the household in whatever capacity suits you." He had not looked at the gloves. He had looked at Nell. And Nell had said, "Yes, Your Grace," and continued sorting gloves because she did not know what else to do, and because his looking at her had produced in her chest a sensation she immediately set about suppressing. She had suppressed it with considerable success for 14 months. The new Duchess's name was Harriet Moncrief, and she had been Miss Harriet Moncrief of Dorset for 31 years before she was contracted to become the 2nd Duchess of Ashmore in a negotiation that Nell knew of only through fragments. There was a conversation overheard in the library, a letter she had carried sealed from the Duke's study to the post. The expression on the face of Mr. Greer the solicitor, when he had arrived in October and departed again 2 days later, with a signed document in his case. The Duke had told no one in the household what the document contained. He had come down to breakfast the morning after Mr. Greer's departure and asked for his correspondence and eaten his toast in silence. And Nell, who had brought the toast because the footman assigned to that task had been briefly indisposed, had set the plate at his left hand and made to withdraw, and he had said, without looking up, "I am to be married in December. I wished you to hear it from me before the household receives the formal notice." Nell had said, "Thank you, Your Grace. I am certain she will be an excellent mistress to Ashmore." He had looked up then, briefly, and she had looked away, and the conversation had ended. She had wept on that occasion as well. That had been a private and managed grief, and she had dealt with it by reorganizing the linen cupboard on the 2nd floor with a thoroughness that had impressed even Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper. This was different. The new Duchess came up the steps of Ashmore Park on the arm of the Duke and surveyed the assembled household with a calm and steady intelligence that reminded Nell of her mother in the act of taking the measure of a new situation before committing herself to it. Harriet Moncrief, now Harriet Whitmore, Duchess of Ashmore, was not beautiful in the mode the season favored. She was not fashionably slight, not dramatically fair, not possessed of the kind of arranged loveliness that required the frame of a ballroom to read correctly. She was a woman of medium height and brown eyes and a face that had learned, apparently, that expression was a resource to be spent with care. She looked at the assembled servants with a directness that was neither warmth nor coldness, but something in between. The look of a woman who intends to know the names and functions of everyone in a household and has already begun the work of it in her mind. She paused when her gaze reached Nell. Not for long. 2 seconds. Perhaps 3. Long enough for Nell to feel it as a weight. Long enough for Nell to understand, with the particular clarity of intuition rather than reason, that this woman already knew her name. If the household of Ashmore Park had spent the 14 months since the late Duchess's death assigning Nell a position, that position was comfortable and unexamined. She was the late Duchess's maid. She had remained on out of loyalty, or sentiment, or practicality, depending on who was offering the explanation. She had been given a room on the upper servants' floor and a small increase in wages, and no official designation that any of them could name. To Mr. Foyle, the butler, she was an irregular arrangement. To Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, she was a useful pair of hands in search of a proper category. To the lower housemaids, she was the sad one who had stayed. None of them, including Nell herself, had thought very carefully about what she was to the Duke, because thinking carefully about it would have required examining a set of small facts that were more comfortable in aggregate than in analysis. He had consulted her before acquiring the late Duchess's correspondence, that he asked her opinion of the household menus when Mrs. Hartwell presented them for his approval, that he had twice come to the door of whatever room she was working in and stood in the doorway without speaking until she noticed him, and that on both occasions the conversation that followed had lasted considerably longer than the ostensible reason for his appearing. None of this was improper. None of it was anything. It was simply the way the house had moved through those 14 months, and Nell had not allowed herself to name it, because naming it would have required her to examine what she wanted. And what she wanted was not something she permitted herself to examine. The new Duchess examined it in the first week. She did this with the same directness and economy she brought to everything. She asked Mrs. Hartwell for a full account of the household's current composition and duties. She asked Mr. Foyle for a record of the previous year's expenditures. She toured the house in the company of the housekeeper on the second day, room by room, asking questions that were specific and unembarrassed. On the morning of the 4th day, she summoned Nell to the morning room. Nell stood in the morning room while the Duchess sat behind the small desk that had been the late Duchess's desk and looked at her. The desk had been moved from its corner to face the window. This was the first material change Harriet Whitmore had made to Ashmore Park, and Nell noticed it because she had been the one who dusted that desk for 3 years and had carried her own image of it as fixed in its corner. The way certain things become fixed in places that know them. Mrs. Hartwell tells me your position in this household is not formally designated, the Duchess said. That is correct, Your Grace. She tells me you were my predecessor's lady's maid for slightly over 2 years and have remained in the household at the Duke's request without an assigned role since her death. Yes, Your Grace. The Duchess was quiet for a moment. She was looking at Nell in the same way she had looked at her in the courtyard, with that weight of already knowing something. I am told you are very good at your work, she said. I am further told, though not by anyone who intended to tell me, that the Duke relies on you in a number of small ways that ought formally to belong to other members of the household staff. Nell did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would not be either a denial or a confirmation, and neither felt honest. "I am not going to make this uncomfortable," the Duchess said. She folded her hands on the desk with a composed economy of movement that Nell's mother had used when she wished to communicate that she had made up her mind, and the conversation was now proceeding on known ground. "I intend to offer you the position of my own lady's maid, if you are willing to take it. The wages are appropriate to that station, and you will have the use of the room you are currently in. I have been told it is the best room on the servants' floor, and I see no reason to alter what works." "Your Grace," Nell said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. "I am grateful. I would be glad to serve you." The Duchess nodded. Then she said in a different register, quieter and more personal, "I want you to know that I am not your enemy." Nell looked at her. "I am aware," the Duchess continued, still quiet, "that 14 months is a long time to live in a particular uncertainty, and that my arrival resolves it in ways that are not entirely welcome. I am not insensible to what that costs. I am only saying that I intend to be a fair mistress, and that I hope, in time, to be more than merely fair." Nell could not speak for a moment, not because she was weeping, not yet, but because the honesty of the woman in front of her was doing something to the careful structure she had built over 14 months of useful, busy, well-organized feeling. "You are very kind, Your Grace," she managed. "I am practical," the Duchess said. "Kindness and practicality tend to coincide more often than people assume." This was when Nell understood the second reason she had wept in the passage, not only because the Duchess reminded her of her mother, but also because the Duchess reminded her of the person Nell herself had been trying to be for 14 months, and had been failing at in ways she had not permitted herself to name. If you have felt, watching someone you care for go on with the business of living in a way that excludes you, the particular combination of grief and relief that attends their happiness, leave a word in the comment below. It is a feeling this story knows well. The weeks that followed were instructive. Nell had expected to find the new Duchess difficult, or cold, or occupied entirely with the performance of her new position. She had expected to be reminded, daily and by the small calibrations of the household, that her time of irregular importance was concluded. She had not expected to find the Duchess interesting. Harriet Whitmore was interested in Ashmore Park in the way that certain people are interested in things they intend to understand rather than merely possess. She asked questions. She visited the tenant farms in the third week, accompanied by Mr. Greer's representative and the estate steward, a quiet man named Colton who had been at Ashmore longer than anyone still living there. She sat in the evening in the library and read the estate papers rather than the lending library novels that had been stacked on the side table for her comfort. She played the pianoforte for half an hour each morning before breakfast with the doors closed, and the music she played was not the fashionable pieces Nell expected, but something older and more considered, the kind of music that did not require an audience. She was, Nell began to understand, not performing being a duchess. She was learning how to be one. The Duke watched his new wife with the same quality of attention he had, in a different mode, previously brought to other things in the household. Nell noticed this because it was her position, now, to be in rooms where the Duchess was, and because noticing things was as natural to her as breathing. He watched Harriet Whitmore across dining tables and drawing rooms and estate discussions with the expression of a man who has been told to expect one thing and has found another, and is still engaged in the work of revision. He was not cold to her. He was not warm. He was correct and courteous and present. A man doing his duty. And his duty in this instance required him to be married to a woman he did not know. Nell thought, watching, that he would do his duty well. She thought this was probably going to be enough, and that enough was not nothing. and that she herself had been living on enough for 14 months and had found it sustainable. It was the morning of the 4th week, on a Tuesday, that things altered. Nell was in the Duchess's dressing room when the raised voices reached her from the corridor outside. Not loud voices, not angry voices, but the controlled and careful voices of two people managing a disagreement in the manner the period required of them, which meant that each word was precise, and each pause was weighted, and the volume remained entirely respectable, while the temperature dropped considerably. The Duke and the Duchess. Nell did not move. She went on folding a length of ribbon as she had been folding it, and attended to the voices, because attending to voices was part of her work, in the old sense that a lady's maid must know the state of the household in order to be useful in it. She could not hear the substance of the disagreement. She could hear the Duchess's tone, which was not accommodating in the way that some women's tones became accommodating under pressure. It remained level. It asked something. It received, from the Duke's voice, a response that was also level, but which contained inside its levelness a compression, the sound of a man who has been managing his own interior for a very long time and has become very good at it. Then there was a silence. Then a door. She heard his footsteps going away. She heard the Duchess come into the dressing room. Harriet Whitmore stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at Nell folding the ribbon and at the window beyond Nell and at some middle distance that was probably the difficulty in the corridor. "He is not unreasonable," the Duchess said, though Nell had not asked. "He is only very much accustomed to silence as a mode of management." Nell set the ribbon down. "Yes, Your Grace." "Did you find it difficult?" The question was unexpected. Nell looked at her. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." "The management by silence," the Duchess said. She came to the chair near the window and sat in it, which was something the late Duchess had also done when she did not want the conversation to be formal. "I understand you were close to the household's management during the period of his grief. Mrs. Hartwell is very precise, but she speaks in practical terms only. You, I think, have other kinds of terms." Nell considered. "He is not unkind," she said after a moment. "He is careful. There is a difference between a man who is silent, because he does not care, and a man who is silent because he is afraid of what might come out of him if he speaks." The Duchess looked at her steadily. "And which is he?" "The second, Your Grace." "Without question." The Duchess was quiet for a moment. "That is useful," she said finally. "Thank you." She said nothing further, and Nell resumed her work, and the morning continued in its ordinary way. Something had shifted in the room, some small adjustment in the quality of attention between them, and Nell was aware of it as she was aware of most things. Precisely, and with a quietness that did not require action. She thought, on her way down the back stairs that afternoon, about what she had said. That there is a difference between silence as indifference and silence as self-management. She had been telling the Duchess something true about the Duke. She had also been telling the Duchess something true about herself, though the Duchess had not been asking. The second time Nell wept at Ashmore Park was in December, 6 weeks after the new Duchess arrived. She was in the late Duchess's sitting room, which was now the Duchess's sitting room, and smelled of a different scent now. Warm and slightly resinous where the late Duchess had preferred something lighter. Nell was hanging a new set of curtains that the Duchess had requested, heavy green velvet against the December chill, and she was doing this on a small ladder with the full weight of the fabric over her arm when the Duke came to the door of the room. He did not knock. He had never knocked on the doors of rooms he was looking into at Ashmore Park. He stood in the doorway, as he always had, and looked at the room as it was becoming. The new curtains and the rearranged desk, and the small vase of holly the Duchess had placed on the windowsill, and his face had the expression Nell had learned to read and had never named aloud. It was the expression of a man standing at the edge of something he did not know how to enter. "She has changed the room," he said. "Yes, Your Grace." Nell came carefully down the ladder with the curtain over her arm. She asked for the heavier curtains. December requires them. "Yes," he said. He was still looking at the room. He was looking, Nell realized, at the chair near the window where the late Duchess had sat for 3 years, and where the new Duchess now sat in the evenings. The chair had not moved. The Duchess had not moved it. "She left the chair," Nell said. He looked at her. He did not speak immediately. When he did, his voice was the voice he used when he was being careful. "She is considerate," he said. "She is," Nell agreed. She set the curtain over the rod and reached for the second panel. "She is considerably more than considerate, Your Grace. I expect you are beginning to know that." The silence that followed was longer than usual. Nell kept her attention on the curtain. She was aware, in the way she was always aware of him when he was in a room with her, of his stillness. "Nell," he said. It was the first time in 3 years that he had used her given name. She had been Eleanor Foss, and then she had been the late Duchess's maid, and then she had been a useful irregularity, and she had been, in the domestic vocabulary of Ashmore Park, a great many things that were not her name. She turned from the curtain rod. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, or perhaps had seen and not permitted herself to examine. It was not the expression of a man managing himself. It was the expression of a man who has, in the process of arriving somewhere he expected to dread, discovered something unexpected, and is grappling with the honesty of it. "You are happy for her," he said. It was not quite a question. Nell thought about it. "Yes," she said. "I believe I am." "Even though," he said, and did not finish the sentence. "Even though," she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "She thinks well of you. She told me so yesterday." "I think well of her," Nell said. "She is the kind of woman who deserves to be thought well of." He nodded once. He looked at the chair near the window again. Then he turned and went away, and Nell turned back to the curtain, and the cold December light came through the window and fell on the chair, and the holly, and the green velvet in her hands, and she wept quietly, and without drama, the way she wept at things that were finished, the way her mother had taught her to weep. Briefly and privately, with the back of her wrist, and then no more. The Christmas entertainments at Ashmore Park were the first the house had held since the late Duchess's illness had curtailed them 2 years before. The Duchess had organized them with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, consulting Mrs. Hartwell and Mr. Foyle and the estate steward, and on 2 occasions that Nell had observed, the Duke himself. He had sat with her in the library for an hour on the first of these occasions, and Nell, passing in the corridor with an armful of pressed linens, had heard through the slightly open door something she had not heard in this house since she arrived in it. It was the sound of the Duke's voice when he was not being careful. He was telling the Duchess about the orchards. The estate had 4, and one of them, on the eastern side, had a history he apparently knew in some detail, something about his grandfather, and a wager, and a particular variety of apple that had not been cultivated anywhere else in the county. He was telling this story with a quality of ordinary pleasure, the way a man speaks when he is not monitoring his speaking. Nell did not stop to listen. She went on with the linens. She was smiling, and she was aware of it, and she did not suppress it, which was new. The Christmas gathering brought to Ashmore Park a collection of neighboring families and county acquaintances, and two of the Duke's cousins, one of whom was a small, precise woman named Mrs. Alderton, who had known the late Duchess well and regarded the new Duchess with the particular attention of a woman who has decided to be fair, but has not yet made up her mind about what fair will cost her. Nell watched Mrs. Alderton watch the Duchess across a candlelit dinner on Christmas Eve, and saw the moment when Mrs. Alderton revised her assessment. The Duchess had said something to the elderly deaf gentleman on her left, something that required her to lean in and speak twice, and then produce a small pen and card from her pocket and write it down. And the gentleman had laughed for the first time in the evening, and Mrs. Alderton's expression shifted from guarded to genuinely warm. The Duke had seen it too. Nell knew because she was watching him when it happened, and his face did the thing it did that he did not know it did, or perhaps knew, and had long ago decided to allow. It became, for a moment, entirely unmanaged. Lady Alderton, who was a different person entirely from Mrs. Alderton, and was seated on the Duke's right, said something to him that Nell could not hear. He responded. Lady Alderton glanced down the table at the Duchess and said something further. The Duke said something that made Lady Alderton laugh and pat his hand and turn back to her plate with an air of considerable satisfaction. Nell told herself she had noticed none of this. The last event of the Christmas gathering was a small evening gathering on the 27th, 30 people in the long drawing room, a fire built high against the December cold. The young woman from the Hartley estate who played the violin standing near the instrument in conversation with the Duchess, who had apparently expressed interest in the particular piece she had played earlier. Nell was in the room in the capacity of a maid who has arranged the tea service and is maintaining the availability of it, which meant she was in the room in the capacity of a woman who watches. The Duke was standing near the terrace doors with his cousin Mr. Whitmore, a comfortable man of 40 who had the Duke's height without the Duke's particular quality of managed stillness. They were discussing something in the easy shorthand of men who have known each other since boyhood, and the Duke was more relaxed than Nell had seen him in company for a very long time, which she attributed to the Christmas gathering having gone well, and to the fact that the new Duchess had, in 36 days, already made Ashmore Park feel less like a house in which someone had recently died. She was not watching him. She was attending to the tea service. She noticed when he moved, because she always noticed when he moved, and what she noticed was that he had crossed the room with the particular deliberateness that meant he had decided to do something he had been thinking about doing. She did not look up from the tea service. She heard his voice behind her say, "Your Grace." She heard the Duchess's voice say, "Yes?" in the tone it took when he initiated a conversation rather than responded to one, which was a tone of mild attentiveness that was beginning to carry. Nell thought, a quality that had not been present in October. She poured tea for a small elderly woman who had appeared at the table and explained that she was the Miss Hartley who used to be a Moncrief before she was a Hartley, which meant she was a relation of the new Duchess. And Nell listened to the small elderly woman's account of this relationship with all the attention it required, and none left over for what was happening behind her. She knew what was happening behind her. Later, after the guests had gone and the drawing room was being restored to its ordinary state, the Duchess came to find Nell in the corridor outside. She was still in her evening dress, and she was carrying her gloves in one hand rather than wearing them, which meant the evening had ended at some point in a particular manner. The kind of manner that makes it difficult to remember to put your gloves back on properly. "I am going up," the Duchess said. It was said in the tone of a report rather than an announcement. "Yes, Your Grace," Nell said. "I will come up directly." The Duchess looked at her. Then she said, in the quiet and personal register she used when she intended to be honest. He asked me to walk in the gardens tomorrow morning, if it does not rain. It will not rain, Nell said. The sky was clear this evening. Good, the Duchess said. She paused. Nell. Nell looked at her. I want you to know, the Duchess said, that I am aware of what you have given this house. Both the things you did for it that are visible and the things you did for it that are not. She said this with the same directness she brought to everything, without sentimentality and without apology. The way her mother had spoken when she wanted to say something true and have it received as true, without a great deal of embellishment. I do not intend to forget it. Nell could not speak for a moment. You are very kind, Your Grace. I told you, the Duchess said, that I am practical. But her expression, for just that moment, was neither practical nor kind in any managed sense, and Nell recognized it because she had seen it in her own mirror during the 14 months, and it was the expression of a woman who has understood something that costs something to understand, and has decided to understand it anyway. The morning garden walk took place on the 28th of December, clear and cold. The sky a winter white over the bare oaks and the frosted stone of the balustrade. Nell did not observe it. She was in the linen room on the 3rd floor, reorganizing a section of shelving that did not require reorganization, and doing it with great thoroughness. She had made peace, during those months, with the particular arithmetic of her situation. And peace was not indifference, and was not unhappiness. It was the state of having looked clearly at what was and what could not be, and having chosen, freely, to remain inside the life available, rather than grieving perpetually for the life that was not. The house required her. The Duchess had asked her to stay. The work was good work, and the room on the upper servants' floor was a better room than most women in her position ever occupied, and there was a quality to the days at Ashmore Park, even the ordinary days, that she had learned to recognize as something close to contentment, if she did not push on it too hard. She pushed on it, sometimes. She was honest enough with herself to know this. There was also this. The Duke, in asking a woman of Harriet Moncrieff's particular quality to be his Duchess, had made a choice that was not merely practical. He had, in his careful and managing way, chosen someone worth choosing. And Harriet Whitmore had, in her direct and unapologetic way, made Ashmore Park into a house that felt, increasingly, like a house in which ordinary happiness was possible. The kind of ordinary happiness that does not announce itself, but accumulates in small and particular ways. A piano played each morning with the doors closed, a vase of holly on a windowsill, the sound of the Duke's voice when he was not being careful. These were not her happinesses. They were the house's happinesses. She had found that she could carry the distinction. By February, the garden walk had become a regular occurrence, 3 mornings a week when the weather permitted, and by March it had become the occasion on which the Duke and the Duchess discussed the estate matters they could not easily address in formal household settings, which meant Nell heard about the orchards in considerable detail as the weeks went on, and found she had developed opinions about them. In April, the Duchess asked her to accompany them for a portion of one walk, on the grounds that Nell had managed the household during the period of uncertainty and might have useful observations about the East Wing repairs. Nell did this and offered her observations, and walked back to the house at a distance of 2 steps behind and to the left, while the Duke and the Duchess continued a conversation they had apparently been having in installments across several weeks. It was on this walk, in April, that Nell saw clearly, and for the first time, what had been accumulating since December. Not as a revelation, but as an arrival. The thing that had been coming for months, finally present enough to see in its whole shape. They were standing at the edge of the rose garden, which was not yet in flower, and the Duke had said something to the Duchess in a low voice, something Nell could not hear, and the Duchess had turned to look at him with an expression that was unguarded in the way her expressions had not been in October. And the Duke's face had the quality Nell had seen at the Christmas dinner, entirely unmanaged. And Nell had the experience, at that moment, of looking at something that was whole in itself and therefore complete. She had loved him, she supposed, in the way that it is possible to love someone you have no claim on, quietly and at a careful distance, and in doing so, she had prepared herself, quite without knowing it, to recognize what he was, and to want for him what he deserved. She did not think she would weep about this. She thought it would simply become part of the texture of the life she was living at Ashmore Park, another particular thing she carried with the practicality that her mother had given her, and that the Duchess, it turned out, also possessed. The rose garden came into flower in May. Nell cut the first blooms of the season and brought them to the Duchess's sitting room on a Tuesday morning, a small arrangement in a pale blue vase, and set them on the desk by the window that now faced the light. The Duchess looked up from her letter. "The first roses," Nell said. The Duchess looked at the flowers for a moment. "From which garden?" "The East Garden, Your Grace. The ones that come earliest." "My husband's grandmother planted those," the Duchess said, which meant she had been learning the orchards and the gardens with the same systematic attention she had brought to everything else. She was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable determination. "She was, I am told," Nell agreed. She set the vase straight on the desk and stepped back. "The household agrees she was the making of the East Wing." "I am inclined to think well of her," the Duchess said. She looked at the roses and then at Nell with the expression that was direct and warm and occasionally inconvenient. The expression of a woman who perceives things and does not pretend otherwise. "Are you content, Nell?" The question was asked in the direct and personal register, and it deserved a direct and personal answer. Nell considered it with the honesty it asked for. The room was bright with May light. The roses in the pale blue vase were the yellow-white of early season, the kind that opened slowly and last. The piano in the morning room below was faintly audible, something the Duchess had been learning for the past month, a piece that came through the floor in fragments each morning and was beginning, now, to hold together. "Yes," Nell said. "I believe I am." The Duchess held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once, the nod of a woman who has been told something true and intends to carry it carefully, and returned to her letter. Nell went back to her work. The house settled into its ordinary summer around them, the particular quiet of a house that has found its rhythm. And in the evenings when the long light came through the windows of Ashmore Park and lay across the floors in warm and patient stripes, Nell moved through the rooms with the ease of a woman who knows each one as she knows her own hands, and the Duchess's voice could be heard in the library, and the Duke's voice could be heard answering, and the piano in the morning room stood open and waiting. If she had spoken the whole truth to the Duchess that morning in May, she would have said that she wept when the Duchess arrived, because she recognized in her the kind of woman who makes a place better than she found it, and she was afraid of what that would cost her. And it had cost something she valued. And she found that she was glad the Duchess came all the same. This is what my mother would have called being practical about happiness. I have learned it is the most honest kind. She did not say this. She was not the sort of woman who needed to say everything she understood. But if you have ever loved a place so well that you wished for it what you could not wish for yourself, you will know what Nell carried in the months at Ashmore Park, and why she was content when she said she was content, And why the pale blue vase on the window desk, in the morning light, in the room that was now the Duchess's, and that had been reorganized and rehung and filled with the small particular signs of a woman making a home of it, was not a grief to look at. It was a home. She helped to make it one. And that was enough. And enough was not nothing. And she knew now the difference. Thank you for staying to the end of this story. If Nell's particular kind of courage moved you, leave a word in the comment below. She would not ask for your sympathy. She might, in her way, be glad of your company. The roses were still on the desk in June when Mrs. Alderton came to call. She arrived on a Tuesday in a smart carriage with a gift for the Duchess, a volume of botanical illustration from London that she set on the drawing-room table with the air of a woman discharging a social obligation she had already revised into a personal pleasure. Nell brought the tea. She stayed in the room because the Duchess had learned, by June, that Nell in the room meant less time spent navigating certain kinds of conversation alone, and because Nell had learned that the Duchess's use of her in this capacity was practical and not a weakness. Mrs. Alderton was telling the Duchess about the late Duchess in the way that women who knew a predecessor tell the current woman about her, with warmth and some pain, and the implicit test of whether the current woman could receive the information without flinching. The Duchess received it without flinching. She asked 2 questions that revealed she had been listening rather than waiting to speak. And Mrs. Alderton's expression shifted again, as it had at the Christmas dinner, from assessment to something warmer. She was very fond of the East Garden, Mrs. Alderton said, speaking of the late Duchess. She said it was the only part of the grounds she could see clearly from her window when she was unwell. The Duchess glanced at Nell briefly, and then back to Mrs. Alderton. I have been planting additional roses there, she said. I have been told the variety that comes earliest was the late Duchess's preference. Mrs. Alderton looked at her. Who told you so? Nell, the Duchess said without hesitation. Mrs. Alderton turned and looked at Nell properly for the first time that afternoon, the way one looks at someone who has been in a room all along and not quite registered. Nell poured tea and did not alter her expression. Mrs. Alderton turned back to the Duchess. She was devoted to her, Mrs. Alderton said. It was said without condescension and without embellishment. It was simply true, and Mrs. Alderton was, Nell had come to understand, a woman who said things because they were true, and not for other reasons. I know, the Duchess said. I rely on it. The visit lasted another half-hour, and concluded with Mrs. Alderton pressing the Duchess's hand at the door and saying she was very glad, which was a thing she would not have said in November with the same uncalculated warmth she said it with in June. Nell watched from the doorway of the drawing-room as the carriage went down the drive. The Duchess came back into the drawing-room and sat in the chair nearest the window and looked out at the early June light on the park grass. After a moment, she said, without turning, the late Duchess. Was she happy here? Nell considered the question with the care it deserved. She was, she said finally. Not always easily, and not always in the ways she expected. She found what she was looking for, I think, which is perhaps the most any of us can manage. The Duchess was quiet. The light moved across the floor between them. And what was she looking for? Nell thought of the late Duchess at her window, looking at the East Garden. She thought of the gloves in the drawer that no one would wear again. She thought of the Duke in the doorway, looking at Nell rather than at them, because there were things it was easier to look at than other things. A place where she was known, Nell said, and a person who knew her in it. The Duchess did not speak immediately. When she did, Her voice was the quieter register. "That seems right," she said. "Yes." They sat together for a little longer, in the June light, not speaking, the house quiet around them in the way of houses that have settled into their happiness and do not need to announce it. And Nell thought about the word known and what it contained, and found that it contained, among other things, herself. Known to the house, known to the work, known to the woman in the chair by the window, and known in small and particular and unnamed ways to the people who moved through these rooms and had come over months and seasons to trust her presence among them. It was a different kind of being seen than the one she had imagined for herself long ago in the passage between the kitchen and the silver room. It was quieter and more durable. It did not require a name or a formal position or a category that any of the household could readily apply. It required only that she remain, and that she do her work with care, and that she be honest when honesty was asked for, and silent when silence was what the room needed. She was, she understood now, good at all of these things. She had been good at them all along. The roses in the East Garden opened through June and into July, and the Duchess cut them each morning herself, which was unusual for a woman of her station, but she had said once to Nell that she preferred to do things directly when she could manage it, and Nell had recognized the preference as her own, and said nothing, only made sure the cutting basket was where the Duchess would find it. By July, the vase on the desk had been joined by a second vase on the mantelpiece, and the morning room piano was mastered, and the sound of it each morning was no longer fragmentary, but whole, a complete thing played in a complete way, and Nell heard it while she pressed the Duchess's morning dress and found it, as she found many things at Ashmore Park by July, a pleasure she had not expected and had learned to receive without qualification.